One of my favourite Lenten hymns is When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And it just enters us into that whole mystery of the cross of Christ. But for this talk, I just wanted to try and reflect a little bit on the background to why we celebrate the Stations of the Cross, or the Way of the Cross, or the old Latin word was the Via Crucis, and why it's so important to us during this season. Right from the very earliest days of the church, the followers of Christ wanted to walk the way of the cross with the Lord. And for the early years of the church, that way of the cross, for many of them, was martyrdom, that they gave their lives themselves for the sake of the gospel of our blessed Lord. And we know the stories of many of the martyrs of the early church, how they sacrificed their lives and rather than deny Christ, were prepared to go to death, really, rather than deny their faith and their faithfulness to Christ. As the early church progressed, then the church really became accepted within the public forum. And so many people then wanted to, in some way or other, make a journey of penance to walk the way of the cross with the Lord. And so what we see really is people then starting to try and visit, if they were away from the Holy Land, to try and visit the Holy Land and to be part of the celebrations there during the season of Lent, and particularly in Holy Week, to experience something of the journey that Christ himself made to the cross, the way of Calvary. And so some of the celebrations that we have in Holy Week date back to those early celebrations in the 3rd and 4th century in Jerusalem, where people gathered and they'd meet in the various parts of the days that they celebrated, whether it was Good Friday, Maundy Thursday, Palm Sunday, and they would meet in the areas where Christ himself would have been with the disciples, and then they would walk to where they were going to celebrate the Mass that day or the service that day, and they'd also have vigils and everything else. So in a sense, that was the start of people celebrating the way of the cross, and that's where we get our beautiful Holy Week liturgies from, right from Palm Sunday right through to Easter Sunday itself. But as time went on, not everyone obviously could travel to the Holy Land to celebrate these events. So the liturgy of the church celebrated those things in Rome and everywhere else, in the same way that they celebrated in Jerusalem. But people also still wanted to have opportunities to walk those moments of Christ's final few days and to celebrate those in love. What we see then is a development of people being able to make this journey, the way of the cross, that we have today. So after the Crusades, obviously many centuries later, what we see is people coming from the Crusades and seeing the sort of things that happened in Jerusalem. They came back wanting to try and create little shrines around some of the major churches and basilicas, for people to be able to walk, if you like, round the grounds and in a positive way, physically make a way of the cross. And this was the start of the devotion that we have now for Lent, which is the way of the cross. So people having experienced the way of the cross themselves in the Holy Land, then went back home and created these holy places. And it was a time when things like the crypts were developing, very much moving images, really, for people to be able to express the gospel stories. And the way of the cross was just such an important way for people to be able to share in those gospel stories themselves. So then what you see is that in the grounds and in wooded areas, particularly outside in some of the more temperate climates, these shrines created, which became ways of the cross that people could walk and spend time and reflect on the gospel stories about our blessed Lord in his final hours of suffering. So all of that developed over the centuries, and it was only in the 16th century that the Pope then defined a way of the cross which involved 14 stations of the cross. And that's really what we have today, which we celebrate during the season of Lent particularly, but it's there in many of our churches, which people can walk that journey throughout the year. For interest, Pope John Paul II publicly celebrated what he defined as a scriptural way of the cross in 1991 in Rome, because the 14 stations of the cross that we normally celebrate, not every one of them is referred to in the scriptures, such as Veronica wipes the face of Jesus and the falls of Christ. They're in the tradition of the church, a devotional way of walking the way of the way to Calvary with our blessed Lord. But Pope John Paul II chose some of the very obvious scriptural references that are not included in the normal way of the cross. So he had Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus betrayed by Judas and his arrest, Jesus condemned to death, denied by Peter, judged by Pilate, scourged and crowned with thorns. And in a sense, that sort of adds a different dimension to the way of the cross for us. So all of that is background. How is the way of the cross for us? Do we use it as an opportunity to develop our faith at times? I think that's part of a challenge that's extended to us during this time of Lent, because they are wonderful opportunities for us to be able just to stop and think and just go through the account of what happened to our blessed Lord, and to, in a sense, realize all that he experienced for each one of us. For the starting station, the very first, Jesus is condemned to death. If you include that account of the Garden of Gethsemane, I find that so moving if you reflect upon all that Jesus experienced following the Last Supper, how he then took the disciples and they went away to this quiet place, the Mount of Olives, a place just outside of the main part of the city. And they would have had experience of going there before. It wasn't the first time that they gathered out there to pray. And what we hear is Jesus is troubled in mind and spirit, and he wants to spend time in prayer. He wants their support. And so in the account we hear how he goes just away from the main body of the disciples, asks them to pray with him, but he goes some distance just to pray on his own and finds them asleep. And in Luke's account of this, we hear he sweats drops of blood. It's really so moving just to experience that as we, think about Jesus being condemned to death. And he asked the Father, only if it is your will, this be done. He's troubled. Obviously, he's troubled because he knows what lies ahead. And yet he places everything in God the Father's hands. And it's, just, if we think about that, it's a lovely lesson for us to think, well, how often do we place our concerns, our troubles in God's hands? We share them with the Lord and then say, but Lord, it's your will be done. And then we make that journey. And then we know then that afterwards, Jesus knows the time is near and they get up and leave. And then what we hear is Judas brings the soldiers to him, and he's arrested. And then he's brought in trial. And it's a complicated trial. He's before the high priests, and then comes before Pilate, and all of that complicated moving around that he has to experience, and the brutality of how he's treated. And that's just the first station. And there's lovely ways in which we can, in different opportunities, just reflect on one element of that account. And each part of it teaches us a little lesson and deepens our understanding of our blessed Lord's love for us. So if we think through that journey of the way of the cross, right from that first one where Jesus is condemned to death, going forward then, how he takes up the cross, how then the experience he has along the way, meeting a number of people, not least his Blessed Mother. I have this lovely image of our Blessed Mother here behind me. You know, in a sense, just a reminder to us of how she's such an important part of our lives and our faith, and also how she experienced and was part of that suffering of Christ, and how she suffered with him. She made the way of the cross with her son, and teaches us also that we have that way of the cross ourselves in different ways in our lives too. You think of the different occasions where the stations refer to Christ falling under the weight of the heavy burden that he was carrying, even that Simon of Cyrene was forced to help him. And the impression he must have made on those people. Each one of them he had a word for, or a look of love, or a word of forgiveness. And in all of that, he shows us that the journey to Calvary was his way of redeeming not just those individual people, but redeeming the whole world. So at the 8th station, Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem who are mourning for him, and we hear his words to them, to pray themselves and really to realize that they would have suffering to face as well. And all it is a word of sympathy and support for them. So rather than them mourning for him, he's really lifting them up rather than being lifted up himself. But then after that, the stations then become Christ alone, Christ on his own, and the solitariness of it, I think, always strikes me that these stations from the 9th one onwards, that we hear of how Christ was stripped of his garments and then onwards to his death on the cross. And when you think of those last few bits of details that we hear from the various passion narratives of the Gospels, they really just stop us in our tracks. That at the end of it, Christ was alone with God the Father. He'd done so much for everyone else, and then he rests here in the arms of his Father. And he faces all, again, such brutality and harshness, and yet all he offers in return is love and words of forgiveness. And also, at the end, when we hear these final words of Christ on the cross, that sense of triumph, that it is all accomplished, that God's will has been done in every way in his life. And in a sense, that if we make the journey of the cross properly, that's when we are stopped in our tracks and we suddenly realize the impact of his life on us all. It's such a beautiful opportunity for us when we have that time to be able to walk the way of the cross. And then we move onwards then to the great triumph of not just Christ being taken down from the cross, but then the sort of, in a sense, we move on to the resurrection and the fact that it couldn't end there. It had to end with the resurrection, where in a sense the triumph of it all was that Christ's life then was raised, and that then raises all of our lives too. And if we believe in him, as the words of the gospel proclaim, we too will have that eternal life. One of the loveliest ways of the cross that I've experienced in my life is on some of the times I've been on pilgrimage to Fatima. And the Fatima station of the cross are quite some way away. They start near to the village where the children had the apparitions where they grew up. And you have to walk some distance to begin that way of the cross, which threads its way back through the hills, back to the shrine at Fatima. And so it's a fair old walk. It's not, they're not close by one another. You have to cover a bit of a distance. And it's on sort of rocky hillside grounds, but it's just so peaceful. And you walk through the hill and reflect upon first the apparition of the angels to the shepherd girls, and then just being reminded of the apparitions of Our Lady there, and then you start the way of the cross, and you have that sense of peace and prayer wending its way back to the shrine at Fatima. And it always stays with me that, because very often the weather's so beautiful anyway over in Portugal, and you're walking along in the sunshine, but at the same time reflecting upon those incidents of Christ's life along the way. And it just stays with me, really. It was one of the wonderful opportunities that I had each time that I went to Fatima to make that way of the cross up there on the hillside. I'm sure you can all think of opportunities that you've had in certain parts of the world that you might have visited, Lourdes or wherever, where you've had that opportunity to walk a way of the cross, which has really meant something to you and brought home much more clearly the journey of Christ, that Christ made to his death and then on to his resurrection.
Shalom World TV coming to Europe and coming to England. That's fantastic, so that we can get the message of the good news out to people. I think many people of all ages, particularly young people, are searching. They're looking to hear a message in their language in a way that they can understand. And good Catholic media can serve that wonderful purpose of getting that news out there and encouraging and challenging people to find out a little bit more of the story of Jesus, which sadly so many people do not know or have forgotten. So it's great to hear this good news of Shalom World TV coming to the UK. May the Holy Spirit shower his blessings upon your work and your ministry in serving evangelization and the spreading of the good news of Christ.